Okay, we are live. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. My name is Ishan Sharma, and today we are back with another Karwan special lecture after a few weeks, I believe. We had a panel discussion in between, then a few conversations, and I think the Karwan lectures has their own charm, so we were missing. So we thought, what better to start April with a brilliant lecture. And I think the topic today itself is so interesting. Color Corpus, Francis Newton Souza's Black Art and Other Paintings. Souza is one of the most fascinating artists. Those who have seen Souza's work know, we all know the kind of colors that he used, but the vibrant colors and palette that he used in his painting, quite disturbing, some of them. But we'll talk about the black art. And for those who have not seen Souza's work, I would suggest you to go to Delhi's National Gallery of Modern Art and see some of Souza's work to understand, be it crucifixion and so many other paintings that he has made. To deliver today's lecture, we have Dr. Atrey Gupta. Dr. Gupta is an associate professor at the University of California, Berkeley, specializing in global modern art and modern and contemporary South and Southeast Asian art. Her research focuses on the aesthetic and intellectual networks that have shaped artistic practices across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, even Latin America, since the 20th century. Her forthcoming book, I think it's already done and is about to come out, Non-Aligned, Art, Decolonization, and the Third World Project in India, uh, around 1930s to 1960s, which is coming from Yale University Press, examines the artistic and intellectual resonances of the non-aligned movement and its roots in earlier Afro-Asian anti-colonial networks. She has also edited Post-War Towards a Global Art History, 1945 to 1965, with the late Okwi Envezor, and her current project, 100 Years in Present Tense, Art in South Asian America, 1893 to 1993, explores this interaction and intersection of third world artistic and political movements with the history of South Asian diasporic art in the United States. Her research engages with the global as a material, intellectual, and political formation shaped by decolonization, and her essays on global modernism and the Cold War and even the non-alignment movement had appeared in the Art Bulletin, Art Journal, Third Text, October, and Yishu, among many others. At UC Berkeley, she has led curatorial projects such as When All That Is Solid Melts into Air and the digital residency Crisis Creativity, Mithu Sen and Brendan Fernandez, organized through the UC Berkeley South Asian Art Initiative. Now, talking about today's lecture, I'll just read out a small blurb about today's lecture, and maybe I'll ask her to also elaborate on this idea and also introduce Souza to those who might not know uh, Souza. In the summer of 66, F.M. Souza's exhibition Black Art and Other Paintings opened at London's Grosvenor Gallery, unveiling a striking series of monochromatic black canvases. This was painted between 64 and 65, and these works initially appeared as austere, immersive fields of black, evoking the aesthetic universalism of post war abstraction. Yet beneath the surface, faint traces of figures and landscapes emerged, perceptible only through a prolonged bodily engagement with the act of seeing. Viewers had to bend, shift, and adjust their vision, enacting a form of optical labor that resisted passive perception. The questions that Dr. Gupta might engage with are like, why did Souza privilege this embodied mode of viewing over the presumed universality of vision that underpinned modernist abstraction? Why did the color black signify for a South Asian artist navigating the intersections of colonial history, decolonization, and diasporic identity? While black in the North Atlantic artistic imagination has long been linked to infinity, spirituality, and transcendence, Souza's black art instead grounded the color in the urgent materiality of political struggle. Emerging in the wake of mid century non alignment and global civil rights movements, these paintings invite us to reconsider the entanglements of pictorial and political representation. They challenge us to reimagine the coordinates of decolonization and creative expression along a far more capacious axis than art history has traditionally acknowledged. So, without further ado, Dr. Gupta, over to you. I'll see you after this lecture for the Q&A. And those who are watching us can also send their questions via the live chat. I'll read those questions out during the Q&A. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ishan. And my sincerest thanks for inviting me to share a fragment from my forthcoming book, which is Art, Non-Alignment, Art Decolonization, and the Third World Project in India. My thanks also, not just for conceiving, but not just for conceiving, but for hosting Karwan in a really increasingly beleaguered time around the world. A time that, in a way, demands an even greater commitment to the intellectual register, to history, and to culture. Today, relentless processes of globalization cohabit with equally global calls to tighten borders and render national cultures distinct, mitigate freedom of speech and action with censorship, and reinscribe otherness into bodies that are unlike and therefore deemed expendable. If the repeated comparison of numerous contemporary political leaders to Adolf Hitler and the global rise of fascism in a multitude of guises is a sign, then we have traveled the full circle. Bracketed by the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe in the 1930s, and the emergence and consolidation of a tripartite world order, that is, the emergence of the first, second, and the third worlds, in the backdrop of Cold War in the decade of the 1960s. The book from which this talk is drawn stages a return of a very different kind, standing in an embattled present. That book, and this talk by extension, returns with even greater urgency to a historical period when the dual end of the Second World War and the dissolution of European empires precipitated efforts by the formerly colonized to reimagine the world in a future tense. My own talk today is an attempt to reflect on the intersections between art and decolonization, and to dwell more precisely on the deep links between creative practices that emerged in the wake of political decolonization in India and the expansive field of transnational solidarities that paralleled it. Put differently, my interest lies in transnational solidarities among the formerly marginalized. We take this journey, we begin in post-imperial London, where a rather peculiar solo exhibition opened in 1966. The exhibition included a selection of works from a series of monochromatic black canvases that Francis Newton Souza, the well-known Indian artist who was then based in London, had painted between 64 and 65. No photograph of the 1966 exhibition can be located. However, based on a 2013 rehan by the Grosvenor Gallery, we can imagine that upon entering the space of the White Cube in 1966, the viewer encountered the artworks, black rectangles of different sizes, just as we are encountering them on the screen today. And they encountered it as an immersive whole. At face value, the paintings, as Ishan said, seemed austere, abstract, uniform, seemingly non-representational, they appeared to invite contemplative reflection. And because pure color, black more than other colors, was most often described by artists and critics in mid-20th century Europe and the United States as a form of negation of worldly values, these paintings too seemingly offered the possibility of a transcendental aesthetic experience, unrelated to the humdrum of everyday experiences. But the promise of transcendence in Souza's paintings were the results of misapprehension. In other words, not transcendence, but the limits of vision, the limits of what gives itself to the eye. For underneath the black surfaces locked landscapes, portraits. And in order to see the figures embedded in black paint, the viewer had to contort their body, assume difficult postures, and hold them until both the light and the angle of vision was suitable for the act of viewing to actually begin. However, the clandestine figures hidden behind black pigment did not necessarily depend on the viewer's vision or bodily contortions. If anything, the complex movements involved in viewing Souza's black paintings only confirmed the impossibility of any unmediated transparency in cognition and vision. In 1966, Souza's black paintings shocked his London audiences because such an approach to color pushed, on the one hand, against the vexed associations between blackness and primitivism inherited from pre-war European modernism, think Picasso. And on the other hand, against debates on color and transcendentalism that were unfolding across Europe and North America after the Second World War, think Mark Rothko. But what meaning did black as a color have for an artist like Souza, a post-colonial artist who had come of age in the 1950s? What prompted him to dialogue with and dissent from the dominant international discourses of post-war art as they were unfolding in Europe and North America? What did the color black have to do with any of this? On this accord, we may recall that Souza's exhibition had opened in London's Grosvenor Gallery only 4 years after the formalization of the non-aligned movement under the leadership of Nehru, Gamal Abdel Nasser, the first president of the Republic of Egypt, Kwame Nkrumah, the first prime minister of independent Ghana, Ahmed Sukarno, the first president of independent Indonesia, and Joseph Broz Tito, the president of socialist Yugoslavia in 1961. It is now widely acknowledged that the non-aligned movement was an epochal event central both to the processes of decolonization globally as well as to the Cold War. As such, its roots originate in the invention of what we now call the Third World, or what is in the post-1990s known as the Global South, in the crucible of the Asian African Conference in Bandung, Indonesia, where 29 newly liberated countries of Asia and Africa had gathered in the summer of 1955 to address international relations, sovereignty, and human rights from the perspective of the still marginalized. Almost immediately, thinkers of decolonization, such as Martinican Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, both would have a profound influence on post-colonial theory, had begun to describe Bandung as foundational for a third world intellectual practice. As such, the political implications of the non-aligned movement including its connection with the African American civil rights movement in the United States, has been explored in recent scholarship. In contrast, although common sense suggests that such non-aligned entanglements clearly rearticulated pictorial concepts, art history has not offered any perspective on the ways in which these may have animated artistic vision. Against this opacity, I will suggest that concerns precipitated by such processes of decolonization were not only embedded in representational forms, but also embedded in the hues, tints, and shades on pictorial surfaces, and that these were always already inundated by meanings that take us far beyond questions concerning painting. Put differently, I will propose a conjunctural history that mobilizes the color black in Souza's paintings as a lens to unpack the intricate connections between liberatory politics and artistic expression in the mid-decades of the 20th century. Let us then track the many courses of the fugitive color black without any further preamble. Blackness as a subject of representation in Francis Newton Souza's work is first intimated through figuration and color in the 1954 painting Reclining Nude. The odalisque-like reclining female figure occupies the entire pictorial surface that is otherwise shorn of any embellishment except for a deep red and maroon backdrop. The very presence of the figure, not because of its nudity or posture, but because of its color, breaks down imagined ideological, political, and social distances between the black body, the dark body, and its corporeal imprint in the history of art. As scholars have shown, even after the abolition of slavery in 1848 in France, the black female body remained configured as an attendant or subversive figure in the works of French artists such as Monet and Manet. And on the screen is Manet's Olympia, which famously shows a dark-skinned male. And Souza, who received training in European academic art at the Jeter School of Art in colonial Bombay between 1940 and 1945, and was introduced to French and German artists by the city's interwar diasporic Jewish intellectual community, was surely all too conversant with these art historical strands. But having no access to African American art and literature, he would not have known of the positive reconfiguration of the black body by African American artists and intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance in the United States. He was surely unacquainted with the works of African American artists like William Johnson, whose canvases not only centralized the black female body, but also endowed it with interiority and agency. How then are we to position such a radical uptake on black bodies by an Indian artist whose intellectual formation occurred at a far remove from the historical crucible of the Black Atlantic, or even the work of his African American contemporaries? Souza, we may recall, had arrived in London in 1949 with a Portuguese passport. Souza's native Goa was at the time still a Portuguese colony and would remain so until 1961. Having once served as the capital of Portugal's Estrada da India Empire, a territory that stretched from East Africa to Malacca in Southeast Asia. Goa had remained connected to Indian Ocean Portuguese colonies through the shared history of Catholic inquisitions, the continued movement of people, objects, and ideas across colonies in Asia and Africa, enduring debates on race and miscegenation, and the experience of ongoing colonial domination. Colonized Africa thus did not figure in the cultural imaginary in British colonial or post-colonial India in quite the same way as it did in Portuguese Goa. For a Portuguese subject, the color black then had a very distinct meaning. Under the oppression of the whites, the black man had cried out in blues, as Souza wrote in his 1955 autobiographical essay, Nirvana of a Maggot. Painted 2 years later, the iconic blue-black figure placed upon the thick white impasto surface in Souza's Negro in Mourning echoed the tragedy of colonialism as recounted in the dialogue among whites, blacks, and blues in Nirvana of a Maggot. As if the dripping lines of pain were but streaming drops of tears, embedded as marks of oppression in the viscous materiality of color pigment. Notably, by the time Negro in Mourning was painted, the history of colonial oppression was becoming entangled for an artist like Souza with the lived milieu of post-imperial London, where artists and writers from former colonies, such as South Asia and the British West Indies, found accommodation in crowded bestsits and cramped apartments in neighborhoods like Belsize Square and Notting Hill. Merely months after Negro in Mourning was painted, violence erupted in Notting Hill, not far from Belsize Square, where Souza himself lived. When a white working-class mob led a week-long armed attack on West Indian migrants in the fall of 1958. I painted Negro in Mourning in London when the race riots flared. I personally think it is one of my best works. Socialist realism, maybe. Expressionism, certainly. Moreover, Negro in Mourning is close to the bone of man because it is about the color of skin, Souza recollected. Negro in Mourning already served to implant the multimodal connotations that the color black accrued for the artist in the 1950s. As a sketch completed in the previous year indicates, the 1957 painting was based on a portrait of the African-American jazz maestro Louis Armstrong, who had arrived in London in the summer of 1956. We can assume that Souza was becoming more familiar with the African-American civil rights discourses as these were being transposed onto the British cultural and political landscape through figures such as Paul Robeson, the revolutionary musician seen here with Nehru, whose oral strains still circulate in India in a number of languages through Bhupen Hazarika's translations, and whose eventual exile to London indelibly intertwined Blackness with questions about equality and enfranchisement posed by the still unfolding process of decolonization and anti-segregation movements. Simultaneously, through Victor Musgrave, the surrealist proprietor of Gallery 1, seen here in front of a painting by Souza, the artist was being drawn into the heart of Bohemian London. He spent evenings in the Colony Club room where artists, poets, and diasporic intellectuals gathered and took noctambulent rambles along Mayfair. at night, or in the early hours of the morning. Through these circuitous ambits, he found bonhomie with diasporic Caribbean writers such as Samuel Selvin, whose rousing 1956 novel, The Lonely Londoners, was an extensive mediation on racial darkness and the color black in post-imperial London. Consider, for instance, the following soliloquy, uttered in a distinctive Creole diction by Galahad, Selvan's Indo-Trinidadian protagonist, and directed towards his own hand. And Galahad watched the color of his hand and talking to it, saying, "Color is you that causing all this, you know." So Galahad, talking to the color black, as if is a person, telling it that is not he who causing botheration in the place, but black, who is a worthless thing for making trouble all about. Black, you see what you caused to happen yesterday? I went to look at that room that Ram tell about in the gate. And as soon as the landlady see you, she say the room let already. She ain't even give me a chance to say good morning. Why the hell you can't change color? It's not we that people don't like. It is the color black. The emphasis on the color black is telling, as is the accentuation of the social transgressions that, according to Selvin's Trinidadian protagonist Galahad, are perpetuated by it. When contextualized thus, it is easy in retrospect to see how, in the 1957 painting, Negro in Mourning, the color black may have connected Souza to an expansive web of intellectual affinities and political affiliations that he had by this time developed. But herein also lay a confounding representational paradox, one that substantially concerned our artist in the period under consideration. Color, which was believed to be subservient to line, form, and composition by art critics, had remained conspicuously absent in modernist art historical analysis and art criticism until the 1970s, at least in the North Atlantic context, that is, in the United States and Europe. But more than any other color, it was black that was caught in a condition of double erasure. For most theories of modern Western art in the 1950s, they considered black to be a non-color and therefore relevant only as a shadow, an opposite of true colors, or better still, a negation of all color. The removal of black from the roster of colors had occurred as early as 1665, with Isaac Newton's discovery of the color spectrum through experiments with light sieved through a glass prism. After Newton, a number of artists paid attention to the mechanics of perception and the effect that color had on the viewer. Scholars have argued that this constituted a chromatic revolution. For within this new chromatic order, neither black nor white were considered true colors, black even less so than white. While Newton's approach to color theory was positivist, that is, based on science, the German philosopher Goethe also authored a popular color treatise in 1810. And this treatise laid great stress on the subjective and emotional qualities of color. Arguably, Goethe's color philosophy was far more popular among artists, but neither Newton nor Goethe, however, allocated black the status of a color. While the complexity within the art history of color is beyond the scope of my talk today, it is worth reiterating that by the 19th century, aside from Vincent van Gogh and Paul Cézanne, the Impressionist painters with whose work Souza was perhaps the most familiar had eliminated the color black even from shadows, choosing instead to stimulate the effect of darkness by combining blues, greens, and reds. According to Souza, the Impressionist painter Renoir disliked the achromatic color so much that he compared a spot of black to a hole in a painting. At the other end was the history of European modernist primitivism, which implicitly collocated the color with the naive, the infantile, the uncivilized, the savage, and the barbaric, originally attributed to any cultural artifact that did not belong to the Greco-Roman classical tradition or to the Italian Renaissance. The word primitivism was, by the 20th century, used specifically to describe oceanic and African art. More pointedly, for artists such as Paul Gauguin and Pablo Picasso, the primitive served as a foil for the other of the white European, and primitive cultural production, many have suggested, allowed for a critique of the excesses of Western modernity. The blackness that animated modernist primitivism, however, had a double innuendo. As feminist art historians have now argued, the tacit locus of European primitivist modernism was a black female body, which became the harbinger of a savage sexuality that exceeded the limits of representation, while cultural objects such as African totemic sculptures and masks took on a central representational role in modern art. Within pre-war and post-war primitivism, the color black then signaled the body and pigment simultaneously. This was calibrated, of course, through the prism of race, even as the agency of the color itself was rarely acknowledged. It was this very elusive history of the color black and the racialized body of the other that Souza's 1954 painting, Reclining Nude, indexes visually. The belittlement of black in color theory, however, was sharply offset by its implacable prominence in a very different register of intellectual thought and practice. For in negritude poetry, the color black was already interpolated by the energies of decolonization. Initiated by Léopold Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and others in Paris, the negritude movement had marshaled the negative energies implicit in a term like negre or black to enunciate a new dialectic of black consciousness well before the beginning of the Second World War. Souza himself had encountered negritude in the early 1950s, not through Senghor or Césaire, but through Jean-Paul Sartre. When Souza first met Sartre in Paris, the English translation of Black Orpheus, Sartre's extended critical essay on negritude, written in 1948 as a preface to a now seminal anthology of African and West Indian negritude poetry edited by Senghor, had just been published. Black is a color, Sartre had affirmed, and liberty is the color of the night. Sartre's delineation of the color black as the only viable praxis of revolution in the 20th century was perhaps most generative for Souza, who was progressively becoming more and more steeped in anti-imperial intellectual movements during his London years. For Souza, the fugitive color, abound with achromatic pigmental materiality, controverted in art historical opacity, resonant with political potential, mattered, and it mattered in more ways than one. Several works from the 1950s reveal the ways in which the color black was becoming more and more central to Souza's palette, in turn fusing representational concerns with questions concerning race, imperialism, class, and keeping the Goan context in mind, caste oppression. Souza's life-size 1959 painting, Crucifixion, depicted Christ not in the form of a fair-skinned icon, but as a misshapen black figure bearing marks of brutalization. In this instance, the coloration of the sacramental body was significant. For unlike the Iberian colonial worlds of Spanish America and the Philippines, where Black Christ, a Cristo Negro, a Black Nazarene, enabled indigenous communities to refashion Christianity in their own image, the color black was already internal to the dynamics of Hindu caste oppression in pre-colonial Goa. As others have shown, Portuguese proselytization in Goa assimilated pre-existing social hierarchies that were ordered around caste or varna, literally color, which historically allocated blackness to lower castes or shudras, slaves or dasas, and other purported enemies of the fair-skinned upper caste Aryans. In terms of liturgical practices, social hierarchies in Portuguese Goa translated into the institution of separate services for upper and lower caste dominations, upper and lower caste Christian dominations, by way of endorsing existing caste-based conception of purity and pollution. That epidermal hierarchies reflected in the representational register is apparent in a 17th century Goan oil painting, which shows Francis Xavier, the co-founder of the Society of Jesus, baptizing a low-caste Paravar fisherman, not dissimilar to the representation of African bodies in contemporaneous European paintings. The figure of the Paravar fisherman also bears testimony to the circulation and reuse of representational conventions across colonial image worlds. As art historian Victor Stoichita has argued, the black skin color was considered to be the accursed mark of original damnation laid upon the lineages of Ham, the indecent son of Noah. Blackness, as a visible sign of sin, was also one of the fundamental topoi of discourses on the fall and of salvation. The operative conceit of epidermal darkness as a symbol of sin, Stoichita elaborates, insists on the universality of the resurrection while emphasizing the inevitable descent of black spiritual bodies into the shadows of Tartarus. The color black, a means of picturing subalternity, was then doubly charged. Souza was surely all too aware of the representational nuances of such color configurations. His creative inclinations were in fact nurtured in childhood through art workshops conducted by the Jesuit clergy in Goa, where he learned to draw by mimicking the 19th century German artist John Michael Hoffmann's blonde Christ and fair-haired virgins from lithographic prints. They wanted me to imitate the numberless religious oleograph manufactured in Italy and sold to Christians all over the world, particularly in the East, Souza recalled. As an adolescent, he contemplated joining the clergy, as was expected of the oldest male son, and to this end took lessons in Latin. But having embraced Marxism around 1944, he came to associate, in his words, the wooden saints painted with gold and bright colors, staring vacantly out of their niches in Goa's churches, with the oppressive social system sustained by the combined forces of imperialism, the upper caste elite, and the Jesuit order. It was now that he also began to explore, in his own words, the history of Chinese, Indian, African, and Persian art in order to seek other chromatic and representational patterns. His 1959 Black Christ was thereby an antithesis to Hoffman's immaculate sacramental body by design. The very fact of color transformed representation, that is, the picture, into a critique of caste and class oppression. Crucifixion was one of the two paintings that Souza completed in the summer of 1959. The second painting, Nyssa Nigris with Flowers of Thorns, was a direct reference to the ongoing liberation struggle in the British Protectorate of Nyasaland, as the title shows. By the time Souza painted Nyssa Nigris, the British governor of Nyasaland had just declared a state of emergency and imprisoned more than 1,000 members and supporters of the Nyasaland African Congress. Against this backdrop, Souza's visualization of the Nyssa figure as Our Lady of the Flowering Thorn or Virgin Mary was, to say the least, politically provocative. As Souza would have known, European incursions into the region began with Vasco da Gama's discovery of the sea route to India in the late 15th century. By the late 18th century, Portuguese control over the region's rich holdings of gold and ivory, alongside a rapid upsurge in slave trade between Malawi and Indian Ocean ports such as Mombasa, led to a complete economic, social, and cultural devastation of the region. The history of Christianity in Malawi, too, was connected to Portuguese colonialism in India. The first Catholic missions in Central and East Africa had been established by Jesuits from Goa. The symbolic, aesthetic, and political import of Nyssa Nigris was contingent upon this long history that implicated India with Africa, in other words, a long Afro-Asian history. Notably, rather than drawing on symbols with readily legible reference, Souza's painting assembled a series of fraught cultural associations. The Nyssa figure resembles totemic sculptures removed from the African continent by European explorers and housed in various museums throughout Europe. Thus, even as the title of the painting contextualizes the figure within the geopolitical space of Malawi, the formal constitution of the figure collapses the distinction between the socio-political body and its cultural manifestation as picture in a way that dispenses with any pretension of representational transparency. The bristling thorns emanating from the hair recall talismanic African sculptures fitted with copper and iron nails and fetishized by artists such as Picasso, seen here with his own collection of African sculptures. The crucifix-like form with protruding thorns ominously piercing the side of the face in Souza's painting then imbricate the entire history of modern Western art with the long history of colonialism. If Souza's paintings from the 1950s imparted a historical sensibility to the painted surface by consolidating a range of concerns around the color black, his aesthetic philosophy likewise assembled several ideas drawn from seemingly distant contexts: negritude, Marxism, and the history of colonialism, to shape an art vocabulary that was entirely his own. British critics, however, failed to make note of Souza's unconventional approach to color, likely due to the ambiguous status of the color black in modern European art. For most, Souza's Christ was most quelling. But the point did not escape the profoundly influential South Africa-based German Jewish art writer Uli Baer, who wrote, "Souza's art, bridging two worlds and two cultures, is of great significance to us in West Africa. From the ruins of our various traditions in Asia and Africa, we are beginning the work of synthesis and reconstruction. By drawing on a wide array of historical sources, Souza," Baer argued, transcended both Indian and European painting conventions to develop a radically new language of expression that not only resonated multiple colonized and formerly colonized worlds, but also centralized a critique of oppression as such. Going by Souza's painterly output, we can imagine that the artist would have readily agreed with this assessment. Overall, the approach to color that emerged in Souza's practice in the 1950s had significant implications for the work that he began in the years that followed. Although Souza did not begin working on his monochromatic black canvases until 1964, the problem of the color black as the primary subject of representation already concerned him by the end of the 1950s. Yet, even as he marshaled a range of historical angles that converged around the color black, the expressive possibilities of the black pigment still remained underexplored in his works, as Geeta Kapoor commented in 1992. A similar opinion had been expressed in 1957 by the British art critic David Sylvester, who observed, "I think Souza will have to get vibration and meaning into the strokes of his brush and into his color. Use paint as a medium of feeling, not as a way of ornamenting." We can imagine that Souza was exceptionally sensitive to critical opinion, would not have taken this charge lightly. In a 1966 interview, he claimed to have fully resolved the pictorial dilemma that was represented by the color black in his black art series. The color black was the subject of Souza's black art series, but not all of Souza's monochromatic canvases were uniformly dark or monotonously matte. One canvas had a glossy reflective surface. Another has a lighter matte black hue. A third is rendered with a minor black-brown tin, and a fourth, shown here, is a mixture of matte and glass. Such variations withstanding, the color black is the subject of the paintings. And it is in this sense that the entire body of works also appears at the first glance to be non-representational, that is, non-figurative, mediations on color. thus seemingly confirming to the emphasis of formalism in critical discourses that dominated the vocabulary in the mid-decades of the 20th century. This apparent focus on the color black, however, was also an elaborate subterfuge of the very critical emphasis that the paintings appeared to uphold. For the emptiness that meets the eye at the initial glance, as you can see in the photograph of the exhibition on the screen, is a misapprehension. As you can see on the canvas to the left, figural imagery lurks immediately underneath the seemingly ungiving black surface of the painting. Although the figurative renditions embedded in the black surface bear obvious stylistic similarities with the works that Souza had completed in the previous years, there is a critical difference between the previous experiments and the black paintings that Souza would go on to complete. In the previous works, figures played a significant role, color withstanding. In the black paintings, the figure is withheld from the viewing eye, as it were. It is as if the painter has become less acquiescent of the viewing gaze. It is as if the color black finally comes to surface out of its own violation. It is what we see. It is the subject of the painting. There is only one abstract canvas among Souza's black paintings. It is composed of a cluster of small squares that seem to replicate grains of wood. The grid-like composition plays with the tension between the concrete architectural forms and the manipulation of oil paint. The surface that thereby comes to the top of the canvas has the appearance of flaking skin that is irregular in texture, cracked, perhaps even brittle to touch, thus stretching the boundaries between what counts as abstraction, what counts as the absence of the body, and what counts as figuration, that is, the representation of the human figure. The idea behind this work, after all, had emerged from an absurd exchange with an influential Paris gallerist whose name was Iris Clert, and is recorded in a letter that Souza had written to Musgrave several years ago. By the way, have you seen the photograph of my floor taken by Gerald Hausen? Iris Clert thought it was my latest style and started raving. John Christopher, a British painter, was with me. He then explained that it was my studio's floor and not my paintings. You should have seen her face fall. Clert's optical error was simple enough. A supporter of abstract painters such as Yves Klein, another painter of monochromes, Clert had mistaken the linear grids of black and white photograph of the studio floor for a non-representation, that is, non-figurative geometric composition. But for Souza, who subsequently reproduced the photograph without any commentary among his paintings in an exhibition catalogue, both the image and the exchange with Clert set the context for imaginatively probing the limits of ocularity, that is, what we see, what we understand, and what we make of what we see. Not surprisingly, he returned to the same photograph and recovered the image into an abstract figure, an anachronistic twist on the very terms of picture making, in his black paintings. This painting was among his first monochromes. All other paintings in the black art series are figurative. The black figures rendered in thick stroke surface as if out of their own volition, only under certain viewing conditions when the angle of light and angle of vision are perfectly aligned. The circumstances of such an optical encounter necessarily involves significant discomfort, as we, the viewer, have to contort our body into impossible postures, difficult to hold long enough for a contemplative viewing experience to take place. That an aesthetic experience, that is, an experience of viewing art, is distinct from all other forms of experiences had been underscored by British art theorists Roger Fry and Clive Bell in the first decades of the 20th century, and showed up in the years after the Second World War by prominent American art critics such as Clement Greenberg. Yet, standing in front of Souza's black canvases, it is impossible not to be deeply aware of the uncomfortable body, desperately twisted in its quest for vision, for seeing. An aesthetic transcendence capable of reducing everything to the same formal equivalent is thus promised in the black paintings, but then forever postponed. Furthermore, the artist had hidden a second multi-chromatic layer beneath the black surface of some of the paintings. This layer has become partially visible only recently, after some of the canvases have developed craquelure across the surface, that is, the cutinous exterior, as the black paint layers have aged and shrunk back, as if to reveal a subterranean anthropomorphism. In other words, a body within a body. The specific method of embedding and layering the body of the canvas, conceptualized here as both surface and depth, the body of color, the colored body, perhaps derived from the technology of transparency and projection, which Souza had started using from the early 1960s onwards, and which made the process of mark making layered for the artist. A 1965 photograph of Souza and his transparency projector showed the artist working on a sketch which is projected on a canvas in the background that contains marks that have already been covered up by the first layer of dark paint. This points to the material and pictorial impact that layering and coating necessarily had on Souza's painterly procedures. But foregrounded in other photographs is another equally important quality, one that pertains to a cautious employment of bodily comportment that distends from the otherwise processual engagement with transparency, projection, and layering. These are not only far more theatrical in terms of framing and the amplification of light and shadow, but also evidence the significantly more performative syntax. Souza crouches on the ground, arms extended, for the benefit of the camera in a choreographed gesture that clearly has more to do with staging than it has to do with the pragmatics of painting. Souza returned to such photographs of himself with insistent abandon as he began to cut and splice photographs in his sketchbooks in the early 1960s. As visible in one folio, he also refurbished such photo compilations with a serial structural logic that implicitly drew into the visual quotient his own body. The photographic compilation anticipated the chromatic seriality of the black paintings, while the cover of the Black Art and Other Paintings catalog reenacted the structural logic of the photographic folio. The latter, no doubt, originally envisioned as a private exercise in photocollage. Aside from such distinctions, the primary additive element in the catalog is a seemingly bland silver coating that, if scratched away by an inquisitive viewer, as you see on the photograph on the right, reveals two dark figures fully covered in a glossy plastic polyvinyl chloride outfit flanking the artist. The cover of the exhibition catalog was designed by Souza, and as such, it elucidates a peculiar dialogic between the ocular, that is, what can be seen, and the corporeal, that is, bodily, that the black paintings also hint at. Precisely how this structural logic springs from the technology of transparency and projection is difficult to extrapolate, as Souza did not expound upon this matter. But the connection can certainly be sustained by way of juxtaposition, as seen in the photo compilation of the folio and the cover of the exhibition catalogue. In effect, the ocular ontologies of the pictorial that were already pre-given in the normative discourse of Europe-American modernism are thereby rendered inadequate. These juxtapositions relentlessly return us to the body, the artist's own body, the bodily quality of the paintings, the contorted body of the viewer. It is tempting to read into this insistence on the body an oblique reference to Souza's Paris-based Martinican contemporary Frantz Fanon, whose profound influence on contemporary intellectual thought and decolonial politics is now widely acknowledged. As others have noted, Fanon's delirious array of self-images in black skin white masks were all tethered to imperialist stereotypes of blackness. And these are Fanon's words. I was battered down by tom-toms, cannibalism, intellectual deficiency, fetishism, racial defect. Such a sense of the bodily, of the corporeal, Homi Bhabha has written, could not be simply assimilated into the Cartesian divide between the mind and the body, or neatly resolved in the epistemology of appearance as distinct from reality, as consciousness and cognition refracts in Fanon's terms in that returning grace, look, a Negro of the white European. The corporeal body was, for someone like Fanon, the source of an impossibly fractured but crucial crucible of a black consciousness that functioned through a making that was not quite its own. Certain threads of corresponding intellectual strands between Fanon and Souza have been alluded to by artist and cultural critic Rashid Areen. But in a sense, Souza's own mediations on blackness in the Black Art series refuses the gaze. For the pigmental opacity in Souza's black paintings categorically rejects any visual reckoning with the color black that proceeds from any kind of generalized dermatological assumptions. Moreover, Souza is not, strictly speaking, an artist of African American descent. And what he insists upon in the place of generality is, as performance studies scholar Fred Morton so wonderfully put it in a different context, and I quote, the irredeemable homelessness common to the colonized, the enslaved, and the enclosed. Conceivably, there is no simple way to communicate a color schema that places color at the intersection of the social, the epistemic, the visual, and the bodily, except through the sociability of viewing. This sociability is how the black paintings were. in the absence of this bodily contact, they retract into the inertness of monochromatic oversaturation, as if parodying the essentialized chromatic values of the color black as a non-color, negation of color, stasis, and absence. This language of negation is exactly what the American artist Renat, another painter of monochromes, used to describe the color black. But for Souza, black was fundamentally kinetic. The color black stood not for stasis, but for the incalculable rhythm of movement that did not heed any protocol that distinguished the aesthetic experience from the experience of the everyday. We could perhaps then say that the body matters in the black paintings almost as much as the color black matters for Souza. We may recall that monochromatic painting, of which Malevich's 1913 Black Square is an early example, had been consecrated in the canon of 20th century modernist art history as a tangible expression of the subliminal. In 1950s Paris, Souza's contemporary, Yves Klein, had already adopted the idea of pure realms of color and color as a spiritual realm. In New York, the color field painter Mark Rothko insisted on color's ability to express basic human emotions, tragedy, ecstasy, doom, and so on. Rothko may have associated the color black with the absolute, and hence the emphasis on black in the murals seen on the screen that he completed between 64 and 67 for John and Dominique Menil's Ecumenical Chapel in Houston. Around the same time, Advenart, also Souza's contemporary, described his near monochromatic black paintings as attempts to arrive at a pure, abstract, non-objective, timeless, spaceless, changeless, relationless, disinterested painting. In hindsight, the association of the color black in postwar art with infinity, purity, spirituality, and transcendence may appear universal. But in insisting that his viewers twist, bend, and turn, Francis Newton Souza may have harbored an aspiration of a very different sort. Let us not forget that when wielded by the disenfranchised in the second half of the 20th century, the color black, the negritude poetics of the color black, the black of the Black Panther Party, and by association, the Dalit Panthers, the black flag of dispersed anarchist groups across the world, functioned as achromatic contractions of resistance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta, for that brilliant lecture on Souza. I think you have answered almost all my questions that I had after reading your paper, which was published in Art Bulletin. But again, the question I think it came to me was, can we interpret the physical discomfort required to view these paintings as an implicit critique of the Eurocentric gaze and its assumptions about how art should be consumed? Actually, that is one question that always comes to mind when we think of Souza and his art.
Um, that's a wonderful question, and there are very many entry points into responding to that. But let me start here. There's an assumption in art history, and when I say art history, I mean the European strands of art history, to associate the aesthetic experience as something that's unconnected to the experience of the everyday on the ground. The painting then becomes a site to leave reality, as it were. Someone like Souza, it seems, at least in the black painting, black canvases that he completes between 60 in 64, um, it seems that Souza insists not on sitting back, um, stepping back from the painting, stepping back from the everyday experiences of reality, and confronting the aesthetic register, leaving behind the experiences on the ground. Um, in contrast, what Souza seems to be asking us to do is assume a kind of an active viewership. And this, one can pass this out a little bit more. The very structure of art galleries and museums, you will notice that typically museums will have seats in front of paintings for you to sit back and enjoy an aesthetic experience. So that doesn't allow for that. It forces you to bend. It forces you to um, be in positions that are acutely uncomfortable. Yet, London in the 1950s and the 60s was acutely uncomfortable for uh, the immigrants like Sousa, immigrants like Selvan, immigrants from the Caribbean, Trinidad, immigrants from South Asia, and immigrants from the African continent. Uh, the racial violence on the ground was real. And this is what Sousa experienced as he walked down the street. Um, at the same time, there was in the 1950s and the 60s an expectation that painting uh, somehow communicated something unique about a culture. Um, there was nothing in those lines to be found in Sousa's work, and indeed in the work of very many Indian artists of that generation. Yet, when exhibited in a place like London um, or elsewhere, critics constantly described Sousa as an Indian artist. They constantly thought a sense of Indianness in his canvases. Um, and when I say Indianness, this phrase is also implicitly always already marked as somewhat exotic. Um, it's always already marked by a certain kind of otherness. And all of this is drawn in and converted into pictorial form, converted into lines and colors, what we encounter in the painting in Sousa's work.
Uh, you know, it seems that Souza emphasizes or emphasized or insisted on embodied and effortful viewing, as you also pointed out, that one has to bend and look at the art, where figure only emerges under certain lighting conditions. What does it reveal about his engagement with the limitation of the optical perception in art criticism?
Um, According to his then partner, Sousa had in fact calibrated
Hmm.
how these paintings were to be used. Um, and he did so in his own studio by with 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 by adjusting the lights, adjusting his own body. So this would so the discomfort is not incidental. The discomfort is written into the painting as such. Um, this resistance to vision, um, and I personally still remember my first encounter with the black paintings. As an art historian, and trained in the discipline of art history, which insists on vision. We are, after all, uh, studying the visual world. As an art historian, I was expecting to see, and it was incredibly frustrating to me that when I stood in front of the paintings, I could see nothing.
Hmm.
Uh, until I bent, I twisted, I moved. And so, in a way, this resistance to ocularity, the resistance to vision, um, is not just strategic, but it gives the black painting a kind of a performative syntax. In other words, by withholding vision, the viewer, and here very specifically the white European viewer, is expected to work in order to actually see the painting. And so in other words, this is a kind of an incredibly active viewership. This active viewership receives an even sharper accentuation when contextualized within the larger discourses of art that was unfolding both in the United States and in Europe, but more in the United States, articulated by critics like Kremen Greenberg, who, standing within the Cold War context, insisted on the disinterested nature of art itself. That art is unconnected to politics. Art is unconnected to the experiences of the everyday, and that it is primarily a formal engagement with line, color, and so on part of the viewer, and hence the contemplative experience. We have to, of course, understand this dialectic in relationship to, again, to the Cold War context, where what we are really seeing is a tension between abstraction and realism. Realism, in this instance, is the realism, the Soviet realism. As we know, the Cold War sort of has these two arcs: capitalism, the struggle between capitalism and socialism. And so all of these ideas feeds back into critical discourse, and those are precisely the ideas that Souza is engaging, reanimating, and working with.
This also brings me to the question of this art that he made, young ladies from Belsize Park, and then in the paper also you connect it with Picasso's painting. Uh, does the process of, if you can call it transparency, projection or displacement, function as a form of pictorial iconoclasm? Is he challenging, or is he dismantling in some ways Picasso's legacy, or is he reinscribing its authority in a different register altogether? How do we see that?
That's a very, very interesting question. There is a desire for iconoclasm. And Souza, more than others of his generation, repeatedly returns to this iconoclasm. In fact, he insists on it. He talks about it endlessly in his communication. Yet, at the same time, he also returns to Picasso over and over again, insistently, in a way that almost feels like an Oedipal complex. But it is not that Picasso, he's able to set Picasso aside. So this is a door on which Souza knocks over and over and over again. And so Souza is not exceptional in this accord. Both the Impressionist painters and someone like Picasso returns both in an iconoclastic mode, but also returns as a kind of as a benchmark in the work of many modernists across the board in this period, from the former peripheries, but also in the United States from the migrant community, artists of the Asian American community. It's almost as if the figure of the artist is always already marked out as being European. And it is this figure that must be dismantled in order to, as both a form of intellectual politics, but also a form of aesthetic politics. And I wouldn't exceptionalize Souza on this account, but rather I would say that this was part and parcel of a larger historical context in which many artists, and I could off the top of my head, I can come up with scores of examples. But yeah, it's not as if Picasso is ever exceeded, but
Hmm.
the struggle is what must be noted.
But in the context of this, how does Souza's use of these technological mediations, as in the transparency projector or recombination or fragmentation, all these alter the traditional notions of artistic authority or authorship, if we can call it the, or what we can later call modernist originality and the integrity of the painted image, because he's actually altering the meaning or the context of the original one.
Souza is actually at the time when he's starting to experiment with the transparency projector. He's also experimenting with what he described as acid painting. It's essentially figures drawn from contemporary news reports and magazines, and sometimes effaced or rather defaced um, through the use of he says through the use of acid, but he um, doesn't actually enumerate what precisely the process is. But what you see is major political figures, controversial political figures, even, as well as major political events, appearing in the form of photo collages with portions erased. And so he's really thinking through what representation means at the time he begins to start using the transparency projector. What the transparency projector does um, is that it allows him to alter the image and project it back. And someone like Homi Bhabha would say that this kind of return, this kind of alteration, is in itself not just iconoclastic, but also a mark of origin. This is how newness enters the world. So um, Souza's retake on Picasso um, is a retake, but it is also the iteration of something new. Um, it's not. It's in other words, it's not simply a carbon copy of Picasso's work. Um, and there lies the iconoclasm. There lies the newness. There lies the originality.
I would also like to ask about the female body in both Souza and also Picasso's work, because given the critique that both Picasso and Souza's work reinscribe the female body as something like a primary site of modernist experimentation somehow. Does Souza's work offer a radical alternative to us, or does it remain complicit in the historical pattern of using female body?
Yeah, Souza is both Picasso and Souza and a host of others are incredibly problematic figures uh, from um, from a gender perspective, and there is no recovering that one. Um, but 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 I will also say though that misogyny aside, and that said, we can never put misogyny aside. Uh, but there's a way in which the female body gets mobilized, not just in artistic works. And here we are not only talking about Souza and Picasso. We could, Yves Klein is dragging nude female models across a canvas. Um, and and so but the way we can think about this though is contextualize it within a given historical time. Um, and it's it's not only the gender aspect is problematic, not just in the realm of art. There, even someone like Fanon um, are often can well be criticized for incredibly misogynist references to the gendered body. Um, yeah, I don't have a better answer.
Uh, but do you think can we see them as can we see Souza's work at least of the female body as an interrogation of the gaze, not only of the colonial gaze, but also the modernist and the patriarchal gaze to certain extent.
I would love to. But I'm also arguing that we cannot extract the artistic, the painterly, and the aesthetic
Hmm.
from the experiences on the ground. And we know, and unfortunately, I know a lot about Souza's relationship with the women in his life. And arguing that if I'm arguing that you cannot extract everyday experiences from the realm of the aesthetic, uh, I cannot also, by the same token, um, recover Souza's female bodies um, as emboldened in any particular way. I wish I could, but no.
Another painting that you mentioned was the Nyasa Negris with the flowers of thorns that was painted in 59. So does it complicate the painting? Does it complicate the intersections of race, of religion, of colonial history altogether? Because what was the significance of evoking this Malawi at a time of anti-colonial resistance?
Souza constantly draws on these movements, the movements that occur around him during his time in London, and the political event unfolding in Malawi um, was extensively discussed in the British media. Um, but at the same time, there was also a period in which Souza is actively thinking through a kind of a global legacy, legacy of Portuguese colonialism. And there, Malawi did have a strong connection with Goa. Um, and so the NASA Negres brings together all of these aspects, but it also um, transpires at a time when yet another race-based immigration policy is passed in Britain, which limits the mobility of immigrants who already are in the on British soil, but immigrants that also the ability of others to migrate, especially from the Caribbean, from South Asia, the former British colonies. And within these discourses, within these legal immigration discourses, color comes to be discussed in specifically racialized ways. It's almost as if the word itself uh, takes on these political overtones. Within that context, turning to Malawi then um, opens up another dimension of Blackness that Souza so insistently returns to throughout his career.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta. I'll limit my questions to there, but I have another 10, 11 questions that I have for about Souza because he's such an interesting artist from that Bombay school of progressive artists, if we can call them. And the whole generation of artists, I think, are important for us to understand, especially in today's India, where artists are openly challenged by the governments. I think Souza's case is a very good case in point for those who want to understand about the intricacies of art, if we can call it. But we have two questions on the Zoom chat. But before that, I'll just end the live stream for those who are watching us. Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta, for accepting the invitation. It was truly an honor hosting you finally. We were planning this for many years, I think I must say, about 2 years. And finally, we could agree on a date and we had you. This was truly an honor hosting you on Caravan.
It is my honor to be here, and my thanks to you for keeping this running. It's been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody who joined us. If you have questions for Dr. Gupta, please email us at karwanheritage@gmail.com. We'll make sure that we send your questions to Dr. Gupta and she can get back to you via email. Keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep reading. That's how you'll keep yourself sane in these insane times. Take care.